The Great Choral Synagogue in Saint Petersburg remembers the war and the blockade. It is a silent witness to what the residents of the city and the Jewish community faced in 1941 to 1944. It was a terrible period. Every day that people stayed alive was a miracle. Only with God's help could many people overcome those horrors. Unfortunately, many died. Every family that lived here lost someone. Every year, on the 27th of January, here in the Great Choral Synagogue of Saint Petersburg, prayers are offered in memory of the victims of the Holocaust, all the besieged residents, all the defenders and liberators of Leningrad. They were first offered on the 27th of January, 1944. That evening, for the first time, a victorious festive fireworks display roared over the liberated city. The troops of Leningrad, Volkhov, and the Second Baltic Fronts had thrown the German armies back from the city and liberated Leningrad region from the enemy. The blockade, which had suffocated the city for 900 long days and nights during the war, had come to its end. The Leningrad residents had waited for this day, believed that it would come. They also had fought for it and defended their city, and so it came. I think that what kept people going was faith in the future and in mutual aid. When people support each other, it gives hope. The hope that the Almighty will help gives strength to a person and is an incentive worth fighting for. Each of those who survived to this day lost either their relatives or loved ones during the siege. Over 600,000 people died from terrible starvation in the city, surrounded by German troops. And several hundred thousand were shot and tortured to death in the Nazi-occupied region. Exactly 1 year later, on the same day, January 27, 1945, Soviet troops liberated the Auschwitz concentration camp, a Nazi death factory where about 1.5 million people were killed, including 1,100,000 Jews. The fact that the date of the liberation of Auschwitz and the date of the final lifting of the siege in Leningrad coincide, in my opinion, is an opportunity to tell us that these two tragedies that come from the same root, from the same ideological root, from the misanthropic Nazi ideology. In my opinion, it is necessary to remind people about this. And I think it is absolutely necessary. History has coincidences in dates and events that may seem random. However, there is a deep interconnection between them. It will take time to figure out. The Siege of Leningrad and the Holocaust, symbolized by Auschwitz, which was liberated by Soviet troops in 1945, are events of the same time. The memory of the city residents who died in the siege in no way conflicts with the memory of the Jews killed by the Nazis. A Russian can, through this prism, better understand the horror of the tragedy of the Holocaust. And an Israeli perhaps can better understand the tragedy of the blockade, which was really terrible, different, not similar to the tragedy of the Holocaust, but terrible. Indeed, despite the differences, the blockade and the Holocaust are part of one common colossal tragedy. The tragedy began with the Nazis coming to power in Germany, followed by their attack on the USSR, but was ended by the victories of the Red Army. It was a special war. It was a war against an absolute misanthropic ideology, against the practice of annihilation and murder of tens of millions of people. This was the meaning of the Great Patriotic War, of the Second World War, and we must not forget this. In 1941, the fate of Leningrad and its 2 million inhabitants was determined by the Nazis even before the outbreak of the war. Everything was calculated and approved by the political leadership of the Third Reich. This plan, which is known as the Famine Plan, it was formulated very frankly at a meeting on May 2nd, 1941, even before the attack on the Soviet Union. It was decided that it would be necessary to take out the maximum amount of food resources from the occupied Russian territory in the future. This was supposed to provoke mass starvation among the civilian population and lead to the deaths of millions of people. The Nazis said that among other categories of the population who were to die of starvation should be the population of Moscow and Leningrad. The Siege of Leningrad was not just a military undertaking. According to this plan, if the population of the USSR, including children, old people, and women, did not die during the hostilities, then it should perish from mass starvation. The blockade was not a military necessity. It was an ideological act. The task of the Nazis was not the capture of the city, but the annihilation of its inhabitants. In this regard, it seems to me that the blockade, as well as the Holocaust, was part of the Nazi war for destruction. The 8th of September, 1941. On this day, the enemy reached Lake Lagdaga, captured by Schisselberg, and blockaded Leningrad by land. All rail and road communications were cut off. Communication with Leningrad was provided only by air and through Lake Ladoga. The city was surrounded by German and Allied Finnish and Spanish troops. The siege ring was closed. The famine plan, reinforced by regular artillery fire, could be implemented, since the enemy's units had captured the suburbs of Leningrad. The entire Leningrad region was occupied, including such cities and towns as Pskov, Luga, Tosno, Tarsky Selo, Pavlovsk, Gatchina. In all these cities and towns, the Nazis began to establish so-called a new order. The first action of this order was the extermination of the Jews. German troops inspected the places where the local population was hiding, and those who were identified as Jews were immediately taken away and shot. Centers of the Holocaust arose near the walls of besieged Leningrad, sites of mass shootings and executions of Jews. They were in all these settlements, large and small, captured by German troops. This is the best documented in Pushkin. More than 24 people were shot right on the territory of the Catherine Palace. They were killed directly against the background of this magnificent frontage. Then, when the corpses began to smell a few days later, they herded some Russian women and forced them to bury the slain. They buried them in trenches. The shooting Holocaust in the Leningrad region occupied by Nazi troops continued throughout the autumn of 1941. It led to the complete destruction of the Jewish population in some cities and towns in the region. In Saint Petersburg, Petrograd, Leningrad, there were quite a lot of Jews, and according to the census of 1941, there were about 200,000 Jews in Leningrad. However, there were only 19,000 in the rest of the entire huge region. Therefore, against the background of general disasters, their annihilation was simply not noticed. The city of Pushkin, Tsarskoye Selo. This place is renowned, historical, and poetic. Today, its palaces and monuments have been restored, and tourists are walking in the parks. The beauty, tranquility, nature, and historical charm of this St. Petersburg suburb are hardly reminiscent of war and occupation. German units entered the city in the late evening of the 17th of September 1941. They began with raids, arrests, and executions of Jewish families and all people who look like Jews or commissars. They examined the whole city, all buildings, looking into basements and bomb shelters. This went on for several days. By October, traces of these shootings were already visible everywhere. Bodies lay not only in the Catherine Palace, but also in the Lyceum Garden, on the streets, in the Alexander Park. They began to be removed and buried. In early October, a registration order was posted in the city. According to it, Jews were ordered to come to the commandant's office. From its courtyard, several hundred people were taken to the basements of the Catherine Palace, and then in separate groups were shot in the park. There was a bomb crater in the Lyceum Garden, next to the pedestal of the monument to Pushkin. Soviet authorities had managed to evacuate the monument, but the pedestal remained. There was a bomb crater nearby, and the bodies of an executed family were thrown into it. Eyewitnesses saw it. They were shot here. They made their last journey here. Rose Field, Caprice, Alexander Park, Lyceum Garden. After the mass executions, a gallows was erected on the square in front of the palace. There were signs on the bodies of the hanged with sentences, Jew, Commissar, communicated with partisans. In the autumn of 1941, the Germans took a young man around Pushkin with his hands tied. There was a sign on his chest. Everyone was intimidated, so no one asked what the sign was on his chest. However, this sign was found in the park later. On it was written, "Judge Dulinsky has been shot for helping the Jews." Apparently, he had expressed some kind of protest. He was captured, escorted through the city for the edification of everyone else, and shot. From the documents of the Commission for the Investigation of the Atrocities of the German fascist invaders in the city of Pushkin, dated February 4th, 1944, in the very first days after the arrival of the German invaders, the entire Jewish population of the city was completely exterminated. Of course, there is a difference between starvation and ditches into which executed Jews were thrown or other places of extermination. But both were part of the same misanthropic plan. The first signs of approaching mass famine in besieged Leningrad already appeared in December of 1941. Nazi propaganda immediately took advantage of this. Leaflets appeared at the positions of the defenders and the city itself. They blamed Stalin, his Jewish entourage, and the Jewish commissars for the suffering of the civilian population. But famine also began in the Nazi-occupied Leningrad region, where there were no longer any Jews or commissars. The Germans had shot them. It was bad for everyone. The famine was especially terrible in the winter of 1941 to 1942, the same as in Leningrad. In Pavlovsk, the Germans organized an orphanage for the street children, for Russian street children. But there was nothing to feed them. And in the winter, they all died, more than 300 children. In Leningrad, January and early February 1942 were the worst months. About 4,000 people died every day. There were days when 6,000 to 7,000 died. The death of passers-by on the street became routine. People went somewhere for their business, fell, and died instantly. What was life like for Jewish religious community in the besieged city? Did it even exist? During the war and the siege, the Great Choral Synagogue served as a prayer house, a shelter, and a funeral home. In the terrible winter of 1941 to 1942, the bodies of dead Jews were brought here. Both the healthy and the weak died. Unfortunately, the synagogue was used for some time to gather here all who died. The bodies then could be taken to the Jewish cemetery and buried according to the Jewish rites in a mass grave. In these terrible days, the community found its leader. It was Abram Ruvimovich Lubanov, who officially became the rabbi of Leningrad in 1943. However, he began to fulfill these duties even earlier, in 1942, when the Great Choral Synagogue was a prayer house, a shelter, and a morgue. In January 1944, it was Lubanov who, after lifting the siege, gave the first prayer service in the synagogue for all the besieged, all the defenders and liberators of Leningrad. This prayer service has become a tradition. The 21st century has added new dates and new monuments to this tradition. In 2015, the Jewish people introduced May 9th into their religious calendar as the Day of Salvation and Liberation. It is celebrated on the 26th of Iyar, since this day corresponds to the 9th of May, 1945. This was the initiative of German Zakharyayev. To our regret, recently we have felt that many European countries are forgetting that there was a war, a victory. How many people died? In some states, history is being rewritten. But we, as a people who have lost 6 million people, must do everything to keep this date in our memory. Our future generation should always remember the slain and pray for them. This is the main goal I wanted to achieve. The main meaning of 26 Iyar is not to let the world forget about the terrible nature of fascism and about who defeated this evil. Not allow those people to be forgotten who, at the cost of their lives, liberated the world from Nazism. The blockade of Leningrad and the Holocaust, symbolized by Auschwitz, liberated by Soviet troops in 1945, are events of the same time. It is our duty to remember this. It is our common memory.